afternoon. Good morning, good afternoon. Hope everyone can hear me. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Katie Sendak. I am the director of the Transatlantic Defense and Security Team here at the Center for European Policy Analysis. I'm absolutely thrilled this morning to be moderating a discussion with three of our absolutely wonderful experts, taking a look at defense technology in the Middle East and lessons that NATO should be learning from what we're seeing over the past 3 weeks in the Middle East. Just a few housekeeping notes. This is an on-the-record press briefing. And before we get started, I'd like to outline that CEPA is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy institution headquartered in Washington, D.C. Any opinions expressed by our panelists during the briefing are their views alone. If you'd like to ask a question during the briefing, please use the chat function in Zoom or the raise your hand function, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. So to set the stage a little bit before we turn to our wonderful experts on all of these issues, we are seeing a rapid, fluid situation with dozens of nations directly involved in what's been going on over the past few weeks in the Middle East. Drones alone, we have seen Ukraine send over 200 experts to the region on Shahed drones, on drone technology, on counter drone technology. President Zelensky has offered a further 30 experts to join the region for expertise. Most recently, President Zelensky has offered interceptors to partners and allies in the region, 1,000 interceptors a day based on their production availability, with keeping 1,000 at home in Ukraine based on their needs on the battlefield. But we're seeing so many regional considerations with major global impacts. We're seeing munitions stockpiles dwindling. We're seeing what we look to understand more, and hopefully our experts will be able to enlighten us with the coordination of allies and partners, what the role of NATO allies currently is, what it could be in the future. And of course, we're seeing it daily in the global markets of commodities, energy, commerce, fertilizer, as the Straits of Hormuz are very restricted by the Iranian government. So we look at the role of tech in this most recent conflict. Obviously, we've seen this over the past 4 years in Ukraine and in other parts of the world. What lessons need to be learned? What's working? What's not working? What is the United States and its allies taking away from this conflict? And with that, with all of those burning questions, I want to welcome our three experts. We have CEPA Fellow Federico Bossari joining us. We have CEPA Senior Fellow, Retired General Skip Davis joining us. Thank you so much. And we have Senior Fellow Jason Israel with CEPA also joining us, who are all amazing experts. Hopefully you know their bios. They have a breadth of expertise in government, outside of government, in the military, in the industry, in tech, and we hope you utilize their expertise as much as possible. So I will take moderator privilege to start us off here with a level setting question. If I may ask all three of you, and Skip, maybe I'll start with you. Where do we stand? What is this looking like 3 weeks into this? From a perspective of Europe and the United States, from a transatlantic perspective, what are we missing? What are we seeing? Would love to get your initial thoughts on the latest.
Katie, thanks. And that's a wonderful introduction, by the way, in terms of setting the context for today's discussion. And good to see Jason and Federico. Uh, I'm glad I'm finally in America once in the same time zone as a press call, so that's wonderful. In fact, in CEPA headquarters right now. So let me take a question. I'd say 3 weeks into the war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. And let me put this in context for NATO and NATO allies. I think NATO and NATO allies should recognize that we're seeing a decisive shift in the character of war. And what Michael Horowitz from this at the Council of Foreign Relations has called an age of precise mass, but I would simply call precision at scale. This war has demonstrated that advanced militaries no longer face a trade-off between precision and scale. Instead, they must contend with adversaries that combine both high-end missiles with large volumes of cheap and attritable systems. And Iran has shown that relatively unsophisticated weapons, the Shahed type drones, costing as little between 20 to 50,000 based on different estimates, can impose real operational stress and economic burden on even the most advanced militaries. The United States and its allies are being forced to use interceptors for defense and missiles for counteroffense, costing billions, or at least hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, and creating a very unfavorable cost exchange. At the same time, Iran has adapted quickly, targeting air defenses, radars, and command and control nodes, uh, rather than simply trying to compete symmetrically. This underscores a critical point. Modern adversaries do not need to defeat NATO militarily in a conventional sense. They will seek to stress in terms of tempo, stretch in terms of geographic need to defend, and exhaust it in terms of magazine inventory. But perhaps the most important lesson is this, that NATO adversaries, think Russia and Iran, and a NATO partner, Ukraine, are ahead of NATO in one critical area, the ability to produce and employ low-cost systems at scale. Russia is working to produce up to 1,000 drones per day, while Ukraine has already scaled production of interceptor drones into the tens of thousands annually and is delivering them to units at rates exceeding about 1,500 per day. These are not prototypes. These are operating systems shaping today's battlefield. And Ukraine has demonstrated a new model of air defense as well. Instead of relying solely on expensive interceptors, it's built a layered system in which cheap interceptor drones costing as little as 2,000 to 5,000, so an order of magnitude below the Shahed drone cost, now account for the majority of drone shootdowns across Ukraine. That's a fundamental shift. The question is no longer how just to defeat a threat. The question is how to do so at a sustainable cost and scale. And so I see quick five lessons for NATO, and I'll just list them out. We could talk about it perhaps in the questions. First, integrated air and missile defense must be layered and cost effective, not reliant solely on exquisite interceptors and high-end deep strike assets. Second, industrial capacity and magazine depth, as Katie mentioned in her opening remarks, are central to deterrence. Third, attritable and autonomous systems must be fielded in mass, not in niche roles, and NATO force doctrine, organization, training, and leader development must evolve to integrate autonomy at scale and breadth. Fourth, the kill chain, sensing, making sense, decision-making, and action, like targeting, is decisive ground in the modern battlefield. And fifth, resilience, both military and societal, is essential because defenses will be penetrated. The overarching conclusion, in my view, is NATO must move from a model built around technological superiority to one built around integrated systems, scalable production, and rapid adaptation. Thanks, Katie.
Skip, that's a wonderful layout. Thank you so much of things that we all need to be taking a look at. If I can turn to Jason next, given Skip's really clear layout of what NATO needs to be learning for this, I mean, should we have been surprised? Where do we stand in terms of should we have been surprised on how this is unfolded in terms of technology?
Yes, no, thank you, Katie. And it's always an honor and daunting to follow Skip. But I do think that one of his great points that he made at the end about doctrine and operations in C2, about how we move forward, is a really good place for me to start. Because taking a step back to my background and I would say my expertise in the work that I do at CEPA, it's very much about the evolution of interoperable unmanned systems. So that is software, that is C2, that is procedures. And in my previous role as the Senior Director for Defense Policy at the National Security Council, we had the operation that I keep going back to in my mind is Prosperity Guardian, where we as an alliance came together and tried to defend merchant shipping in the Red Sea, primarily from the Houthi threat, and some similarities and differences, which I'd like to get to. But I think following up on Skip, one thing that I could add to his excellent overview of the hardware challenges for scaling and what we're looking at in hardware. And frankly, hardware tends to get the attention and the numbers. But I think I'd like to start my comment when you asked about, like, are we surprised? The one thing that is not surprising me is that the software has not caught up. And to me, you have two or three or 1,000 different unmanned systems. Without the software layer and the C2 layer, you could get a completely different outcome from the same pieces of equipment. And that is a massive difference between manned systems. Manned systems, if you think about the training of the pilot, that is working to ensure that the outcome is similar each time. these will, from a headquarters all the way to the effect, what some call the kill chain or the kill web, the software is decisive. And a lot of our work at CEPA has been focusing on that. It was probably my biggest takeaway from the Munich Security Conference when I was there, is that you had many, many stars of retired generals and admirals talking about the importance of this year and next year being the year that we sync software to the hardware. Um, so considering Prosperity Guardian, for example, in both Prosperity Guardian and Epic Fury, the software and data architecture, it becomes a immediate question as to what the drone that you're using or the unmanned system that you're using, what software is behind it. So the question will be, I think, twofold. One is, does the software allow it to be interoperable with headquarters? And then the question then is that software relatively easily flexible to bring in other platforms? And as we've seen on the US side, the scale of the hardware has not quite gotten there yet. And software, as we know, relatively easy to scale. But we're not seeing interoperability between the systems to the point that we would need to fight as an alliance in the future. And I think that's one of the big questions that I have. So we can in the Q&A, we can get more into the Prosperity Guardian versus Epic Fury comparisons if you like. The final point I'd like to make, and it springs from Skip's last point, which was on doctrine. And I talk about this a lot at CEPA, and we do a lot of strategic scenario exercises. Be very happy to do one for the press at some point as well, because it puts us in a sort of a scenario-based problem that we could work through some of these issues. But it's the question of doctrine that Skip mentioned. There's a ongoing question about whether unmanned systems or manned systems are considered more escalatory. And that is a key question that has not been answered. And we could actually examine that question a little bit. But two lessons from Ukraine that stand out to me in this regard, and then I'll leave it here and turn it over to Federico. One is that we didn't do much to stop Russia from attacking civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. We helped Ukraine to make it more resilient, but we didn't sort of, as a global community, try to reestablish a norm that attacking civilian critical infrastructure during winter, for example, was something outside of the boundaries of modern warfare. And now what you're seeing is that lack of a norm is absolutely being tested right now, where civilian infrastructure, global, if you will, oil infrastructure is being damaged. So that is one. The second is Ukraine is probably building and evolving faster than anybody in the world right now. And so the way that companies and countries can partner with Ukrainian companies because of the experience that they've had is going to be very important. But that said, and I'll finish where I started, the Ukrainian model does not have software that blends and all drones interoperability. And so as that lesson learned from Ukraine is applied, we can't have 200 different types of drones in the future that don't speak to each other. We need to be able to develop the software. So I'll finish again where I started, that it's all about the software. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you so much, Jason. That's a really key element as we look at the combination of conventional firepower that we're seeing in the Middle East combined with this new technology that we've been seeing in Ukraine for years. Federico, I know you pay such close attention to these issues and the evolution of this technology on the battlefield. Would love your impressions from the last 3 weeks.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Katie. It's always a pleasure to be with Skip and Jason and discuss this topic. I think, I mean, there are plenty of elements that we can touch upon in this discussion, and of course, coming after Skip and Jason is always difficult to have more ideas because they have already laid out a lot of important elements. But I want to stress, one of the key aspects, according to my opinion, when it comes to uncrewed technology, for instance, and uncrewed systems, as we have seen them, be so important in the current operations in the Middle East. Both Skip and Jason mentioned doctrine and interoperability as key elements. And I think training is also essential. We know that, of course, automation and AI-based functionalities are becoming increasingly, reliable and increasingly also affordable, and you can integrate them at scale in many systems now. But at the same time, for many of the use cases and for many of the the capabilities that have been employed in the Middle East in these days, training remains a critical part of the equation because, for instance, in the counter-US mission set, you need to have very skilled operators most of the time. I mean, in integrated air missile defense has been relying on automated systems for decades. I mean, radar technology and high-end interceptors function based on very automated processes, and the operator has an important task, but at the same time is really supported by technology. But it needs to be very prepared for any kind of contingency. And so training and rehearsal of realistic situation is increasingly important also for the counter-US in part of the equation. And I think this aspect is often overlooked in discussion, and we tend to look often at the the technology, and for the government, for the planners, is always easier to for instance, I want to buy that number of radars and effectors and sensors and put them on the field, and I feel very protected. But actually, that is only one part of all the things that you have to do. And training is a critical element because you need to be sure that you have the operators that are able to use those systems. So if you look at the technology ecosystem, and defense tech is really diversified, but I think there is a key concept that we need to consider when we discuss this topic, and it applies to many different type of capabilities. It's not just about drones or counter drones. This concept is what we can define as a triangle of three T's. So the one of the T's is technology, the other T is tactics, and the other T is training. So these three elements are interconnected and work in symbiosis, and they cannot be separated from one another, because otherwise you end up having only part of the capability that you want to have, and that capability will not work properly. But that said, in general, I think one of the many takeaways from what's happening in the Middle East now is that exquisite systems alone are not sufficient, but at the same time, cheap mass is not sufficient itself. You need to have both, and I think we are hearing a lot in these days that Iran has been able to achieve important results in terms of destroying key targets, whether they are radars or hangars and other infrastructure across the Middle East, but using drones, right? They have been mentioned a lot in the media debate. But at the same time, it's also true that with those systems alone, Iran has not achieved any kind of significant victory. Of course, if we look at the long term, I mean, operational and tactical are not the only levels of war. You have also the strategic part. And so in the long term, we still need to see how this ends. But however, at the moment, Iran has not been able to obtain significant military results against the US and Israel. That's one of the key takeaways. And so you need much more than just cheap drones to win a battle, I think, or a war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Federico. That's such a great point. What is that combination? And again, I know my colleague Michael wrote in the chat. If you all have any questions, please use the raise your hand function or put it in the chat. Happy to relay to our experts. And with that, I'm going to turn back to Skip because there's been so much conversation already about, training, doctrine, personnel, making sure we have the right processes in place to really utilize this technology to its greatest extent possible. And we know that NATO is good at that, right? NATO is good at making the lists and coming up with the standards and doing all that kind of stuff. But we also see this rapid evolution of technology. I mean, Iran has been at the forefront of unmanned systems with its Shahed drones, with its technology, sending it to Russia to be used in Ukraine, et cetera. We continue to see that. I mean, how does NATO stack up in that degree? Recognizing that you do need all of that to be successful, but how do you assess where NATO is in terms of those capabilities?
So personally, I think there's a lot of ground that NATO has to uh, cover to be able to be prepared for a fight like we're seeing currently between either Russia and Ukraine as the primary issue, but also what we're seeing play out in the Gulf. And let me take there's a couple aspects I could grab onto. And since Federico and Jason both talked about software and then kind of the concepts, I'll talk the technology first, and perhaps maybe I can come back later because I've got some ideas on doctrine and mindset changes as well. So if I think just about what are the kind of most urgent capability priorities for NATO, I can rapidly cover them. And I think four or five stand out. First, integrated, layered, affordable air and missile defense. I mean, that's absolutely critical to protecting from the infrastructure damage that Jason was talking about, that we see, right now in our Gulf partners, what we should see in Ukraine from the Russian salvos, et cetera. And in that, the first thing NATO must do is dramatically expand its lower tier defenses. These are the counter UAS systems, kinetic, EW, and all sorts of interceptor drones, et cetera, that need to be developed at mass. And Ukraine experience shows that these systems can be integrated, but and they have to be the most numerous and are the most cost-effective layer of their integrated air missile defense. Second, you talked about this, munitions stockpiles and production at scale. This war has shown, this is the Iran war, has shown just how quickly inventories can be depleted. And the U.S. has already used hundreds of cruise missiles, over 1,000 interceptors in whatever 3 weeks plus days, while production rates for those key systems still remain in the hundreds per year. So how do we make up what we've already expended in 3 weeks, if not in several years of existing contracts or rapid, change? By contrast, Russia has scaled up production toward 1,000 per day of its drones. Ukraine's is producing tens of thousands of interceptors annually and is aiming for about 1,000 per day. That's the scale that NATO's got to plan for. The third thing is low cost, long range precision strike. This because of all our current systems, from our both air, sea launched, land launched missiles, etc., are in the millions of dollars per cost. Now the low cost, okay, that's a couple 100,000, but that's still an order of magnitude higher than the Shahed. So we've still got some work to do to bring down the expense while maintaining the range. The Lucas drone that's being used, which Shahed make look alike, can theoretically go out to 1,000 kilometers. That's the kind of range that NATO and NATO allies have got to seek for. And there's an offset of those multi-million-dollar cruise and ballistic missiles. And the fourth is a resilient command and control. And we've seen the targeting of critical radar systems, like the one in Kuwait that was hit, highlights the vulnerability of centralized systems. And NATO needs kind of distributed, redundant, C2 sensor network that can operate in a degraded mode when attacked, and peace points are lost. And the fourth, I should say the fifth, is integrated C4ISR and targeting networks. And this goes to Jason's point on software. Software is a big part of it. NATO has got a digital transformation strategy and plan that's been working on for several years that will enable interoperability, but the focus has got to be integration of sensor networks, national and NATO C2 nodes. And of course, effectors from various tiers of all types for both defense and counteroffense or offensive strike. And the efforts on open architectures are ongoing, data standards, cybersecurity, all those are important. But they've got to be, like Federico just mentioned, they've got to be regularly tested at scale through training and major exercises to ensure that they are ready for use in defending NATO according to its new plans, and then determine what those gaps and obstacles are and then go after them. So all this, the theme is scale, sustainability, system integration, not just capability.
And those are three S's. Skip, that's awesome. Thank you so much for laying that out for us. It sounds like, and we know as we work on these issues, there's still a lot of work to do, right? I mean, across the alliance, every ally involved to making sure we have what we need and that we are prepared, and so many things to take away from current conflicts. Jason, if I can turn to you, with your policy hat on. Skip's laying out so clearly the work that the alliance needs to do, the priorities that we need to undertake to make this happen. What do you think envision the policy ramifications as we look at securing Europe and the alliance in light of this technology use, in light of we're seeing on the battlefield, targeting civilian infrastructure, resilience issues? Would love your thoughts on policies that need to take shape.
Yes, thank you, Katie. And I'm ready to spend the next 2 hours discussing that because, as you know, this is a passion of mine, but I will keep it to just a few minutes. Um, so let's step back. It is very hard to step back right now because there are people in harm's way, and we have 13 Americans killed, over 20 from Gulf states of casualties, and in Israel, and thousands and killed and tens of thousands injured in Iran. And that is all very, very important. I want to start with that because people are in harm's way today. Stepping back, how did we get here? There's a question, there's lots of questions about how this Operation Epic Fury was commenced amidst negotiations. So there's a precedent there. But the takeaway, and we're not going to be able to answer that here. The takeaway from it, though, for me is a reminder that everything we've talked about thus far in this call is a tool. It is a tool to try to signal to another nation to either defeat or to reestablish deterrence. And how is that going to be done? And so we're seeing that happen in Epic Fury. But the question would come then, which one again we're not going to be able to answer today, but what are the off ramps to the conflict, and how will all these technologies that we've discussed assist us in getting to some of those off ramps? Of course, from the United States and Israel perspective, they want that to be a reestablishment of deterrence and, for Iran to be unable to reestablish a nuclear program, and then other objectives, I'm sure, even though that it has not been exactly clear, what the U.S. and Israel end state sort of objective is right now. But I bring that up because we have to remind ourselves that these can be, a drone it can be an ISR, it can be offensive, it can be defensive. So I've discussed sort of the meaning of it in a policy perspective. We've discussed doctrine a bit, and happy to answer more questions than that if you like. But the final one that I'd like to discuss, and I kind of discussed this on defensive, is from the NATO perspective. There's a lot of spending ongoing, certainly nowhere near the 5% yet that they've committed over the next 10 years. But at CEPA, we spend a lot of time talking to ambassadors and diplomatic corps and in capitals, and those I really enjoy listening to are the members of parliament of the various NATO countries, because the question is, how are they selling the ongoing, conflict, if you will, to voters as far as saying we actually have to increase defense spending, because it's still a wide spectrum of support for defense spending across the alliance. And so while the commitment has been, the headline, the next NATO summit will be in July in Ankara, and there's going to be, I wouldn't say necessarily a report card, but something like it, where there's going to be, looking at each country and how they are progressing during that spending. I think there's a question right now with this ongoing, to Skip's point, about exactly how there has to be rapid scale at this point amongst NATO partners. Will it happen rapidly? And then the question is, if it happens rapidly, can it happen, back to my original point, in a way that reduces, the fragmentation? there. And then finally, because there's been a big question, obviously, I don't need to get into the details because everybody's seen it about whether and how NATO countries are supporting the United States in the Strait of Hormuz and committing. I would say the question would be for each country that is saying, whether it's this is not our war type comments, or is it about not putting people in harm's way, which is a big part of the unmanned systems, right? Is that you're not actually putting people in way in democracies. Generally, we do not want to put people in harm's way these days because we don't want casualties because they're unpopular. That's not a bad thing. But it does raise that from a policy perspective about how you're using unmanned systems, over and over. And so my question would be, what does a unmanned escort future look like to be able to solve a problem like this, whether you have subsurface, surface, land-based, air-based that are supporting a cargo ship as it goes through the strait? We're not there yet, but you could envision that if you could press a button and start to safely escort, merchant vessels through a strait in the future, then that would have massive policy implications. I'm going to stop there because I could go on this for a while, but very
This,
happy to take
yeah.
follow-up.
I mean, there's just such dramatic policy implications as we look at this over time. And this is something we've been studying for a while, right? In all of these allied capitals about how do we do this. So no, great outline. Thank you so much, Jason. We do have a question in the chat from Demian Shevko. Let me just pull it up here. For the new voice of Ukraine, which actually ties in really nicely to the question that I was going to pose to Federico. So maybe I'll do a little combo. Damien asks, how interested are NATO allies in integrating Ukrainian battlefield tested technologies into their defense planning? Really interested. Federico, maybe Skip, you want to weigh in on this too. But Federico, my question was really going to target, Ukraine is sending all of these experts, all of these hundreds of people to partners in the Middle East to really teach some of our partners about the implications of Iranian technology. What are they able to do? What are they able to show, our partners on this? But maybe you want to answer the NATO question first. How are we integrating, or are we? Are we interested in integrating Ukrainian battlefield technology?
Thanks, Katie. I think definitely NATO countries are, very interested in integrating Ukrainian technologies. But I think first and foremost, they are interested in Ukrainian experience. Because, I think also regarding your question, why, is it possible that Ukraine has been able to send hundreds of experts at this point, to the Middle East for, supporting counter-US efforts in the region. There's one simple explanation for that. Ukraine has been, battling large salvos of, all sorts of uncrewed systems and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles combined for 4 years now, actually more than 4 years. They have been in a war with Russia for more than 11 years, and so I think they have plenty of experience when it comes to using this sort of technologies. Just as a reminder, Ukrainian forces started to use commercial derived unmanned systems around 2015, when volunteer organizations were helping Ukrainian really depleted forces at that time to resist Russian aggression in the Donbas region. And so over the years they have developed extremely sophisticated and extremely effective tactics, techniques, and procedures, and also concept of operations that are really the treasure trove at this point for NATO countries. Technology is also a component of that interest, and we have seen it especially with drone interceptors. I think, as Skip and Jason mentioned, drone interceptor will be really one of the most interesting and revolutionary components and parts of integrated air missile defense, especially for the low tier sort of threats. And so that's the reason why many countries are interested in these systems. There are I think almost 10 companies that have developed drone interceptors in Ukraine. It's not just the Sting, the famous Sting interceptor, from the Wild Hornets company. There are, almost 10 of those, very similar systems that have been developed. European countries are catching up and they have developed similar solutions, but at the moment, really the price, comparison is really, all favorable to Ukraine. These systems are really cheap, and they are also very effective because they have been tested in a real operational situation. But beside the technologies I mentioned, I think what is really interesting for NATO countries and for Gulf countries at this point is the experience and how they can integrate, counter-UAS systems into a broader architecture of sensors and effectors, and how they can use them to really solve one of the key problems that we have seen in this conflict against Iran. That cheap drones launched in large numbers are often sufficient to penetrate even sophisticated air and missile defense systems. So I think I will stop there, but I'm more than happy to to continue the discussion.
Thank you, Federico. No, that's super helpful. And I see Skip coming in with a two-finger. Skip, please.
Yeah, no, I think that Federico hit it on the head in terms of, countries are interested, but what I see is I don't see the sense of urgency from the political level, from the governments. I see great interest from the military. We've seen a significant collective interest from NATO, the establishment of the Joint Analysis and Training Center, the JTEC, to connect to identify lessons learned and then propagate them across the alliance. And we see certain NATO exercises focusing on integration of a variety of systems, specifically lower end counter UAS type of systems. But what we don't see is the response to, frankly, what's being on offer. And that Federico just mentioned that. In preparation for today's press call, I identified about 15 different available systems from the U.S. to across our European allies that are being made by a variety of defense industry that are in that field that have not yet, resulted in programs of record. So the supplies out there, the demand in terms of actually buying things based on the defense investment plan from The Hague last year hasn't yet connected. And I think hopefully the Iran war will be another wake-up call to frankly, the relevance of these systems and the need to focus on integration, like Jason was talking about, the lower tier, lower cost affordable systems, and then production at scale.
Absolutely. And let me turn to one more question in the chat, and then John, thank you for your patience. I see your hand up. You'll be next. Skip, I want to add on just exactly what you were saying. Kalal from the Hindu newspaper in India, thank you for joining us. Really lays out, Iran is using its proxies. Iran is using a wide range of tools to, perhaps not secure a big military victory, but make this a more complicated and nuanced effort in the Middle East. The question is posed is, can cheap technology, when mixed with a rules-free war that some of the actors might be playing at, be a formidable challenge to conflict in the future? And I think that relates to how is this technology and cheap technology, autonomy, uncrewed systems really changing the battlefield?
Yes, I think the answer is the answer to Kalal's question is yes, and we're seeing it as a formidable challenge right now. And as Jason pointed out, we don't have the dial in terms of turning this or finishing this war when we want to. Iran has significant capabilities and, frankly, a mindset that they're willing to impose costs on their adversaries, see the U.S. and Israel specifically, but also the Gulf partners that they see enabling the U.S. presence in the Gulf region. So they are going to continue as long as they desire to continue, and we have to frankly respond accordingly. And for the European alliance, they need to see that Iran will continue to be a potential threat in the future, regardless of significant degradation that they have interest, obviously, in ensuring security in the Gulf for the significant amount of maritime traffic that brings energy resources to them. So that's an issue that they're going to have to deal with, in despite of the method and tone that perhaps the U.S. is using right now to entice allies to a response. But I'd like to go one step further, and I think that in terms of doctrine mindset, we need to be thinking about where the big adversaries, Russia and China, are going with respect to autonomous systems. And in this regard, there's a great article out in Foreign Affairs last week by General Petraeus talking about the autonomous battlefield and the kinds of trends that we need to prepare for, where systems are integrated as such and have the onboard technology and AI tools to be able to, from launch to mission completion, operate almost autonomously, perhaps with a human on the loop. And we're not there yet in terms of employing the same types of capabilities or concepts because we haven't developed them, and nor are we ready for defense against them. And so we've got to think about how do we enable a force that can employ systems that are integrated, that can have the right kinds of algorithms, right kind of computing support, et cetera, to be able to do the right kinds of targeting with minimal human intervention, and have the capabilities for rapid in the field software changes like we see going on in Ukraine right now, but even to a more accelerated degree if we were involving multiple allies against a Russian foe, so to speak. So we've got some work to do. And I think that we've got to think not just on what we need to do to respond to current capabilities, but where this is heading. Skate to the puck, in other words.
Skip, thank you so much. And as we've all experienced, policy has a tendency to not move at the rapid rate by which we need it in some of these degrees. So really appreciate you highlighting that. Now, how do we take the present and apply it to the future and make sure that we're prepared? So thank you so much. John, thank you so much for your patience. If you wouldn't mind asking your question and tell us where you're from. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. John Seward with the Washington Times. I covered defense and national security for them. Both of you gentlemen, actually all three of you, have mentioned software being one of the critical aspects of this. And recently we saw the U.S. commit to invest $20 billion in Anduril's Lattice software. And they also, that same company has also made contracts with Belgium and with other NATO partners, specifically sort of showing off Lattice. And the CEO actually has said that there's a point there to help with integration with NATO. So my question is, General Davis, I know that you have seen in the past many different communications programs promise this level of interoperability, this level of sort of communications width, and then not be particularly successful despite their cost. So it's how do we avoid those pitfalls that we've seen in the past, and what does this look like moving forward, that this might actually be sort of that software platform that we're talking about, but very much owned and developed by this one specific private company?
Thanks, John. I'm going to leave some space for both Jason and Federico coming behind me. I'm not familiar with specific performance characteristics of the Lattice software, but if I get the concept, certainly that's something which should greatly interest the allies, because integration is so important. And we've got to come up with a method of integrating all the various types of sensors and effectors with the C2 node so that targets can be rapidly identified, rapidly prioritized, weapon effects associated with them, and then distributed tasking to not just national forces, but to a variety of allied forces to be able to either deal with them, be them incoming threats in an integrated air missile defense scenario, or in a counteroffensive to strike the arch before they come, or whatever. The logistics and C2 layers, EW and air layers behind that are involved in an offensive against NATO or allies. So hugely important, but there are so many things to integrate. And so it could be perhaps something that integrates autonomous systems. That's great. That allows them to talk together with machines and humans. But we have to think at the entire integrated air missile defense level, which be multi-tiered, be geographically dispersed, and that might not serve that particular overarching architecture need, but could provide a component of it. And it needs to be able to, work into a integrated C4SR, which is all about sensing, making sense, and then enabling decision making. And then, finally, of course, the targeting is which the first one that we talked about. I think that's probably the target network is something would be directly enabled by that. But there are other architectures that are part and critical to defense.
Jason, Federico, would you like to weigh in?
I'll just jump in very quickly. Thanks so much, John. And just to follow Skip, just maybe 2 points on Anduril and Lattice. The thing that stood out to me is everybody is watching the Andurils and the Helsings, the unicorns that are, not profitable yet. This was a good signal that their model is working, right? And that's what we're kind of looking for in this area because they're making a big gamble about that they're going to be able to create something that they know will be needed by the Pentagon. Most of my career, and I'm sure, Skip feels the same, is that it's been about developing a requirement that is then put out for bid. And so to be able to have companies that can get a $20 billion contract like this, I do believe that it is part of the solution. The question is it, I mean, it's still small in comparison to your F-35 and submarine, contracts. So will that scale? And having sat in the, representing the White House in all the all the Pentagon budget meetings, we have these DMAG meetings where you basically go through every dollar and you make the trade-offs. And, $800 billion actually goes by pretty quickly when you're looking at these contracts. I know it sounds crazy, but it does because you have so many things that you have to say no to and invest in the future. But software is certainly one that has to be increased. And then the second point, besides the Anduril specific point, is just there is a ongoing question, and this is a very key question, is whether the many different softwares that countries will try to procure, particularly from NATO and others, be able to speak to each other because AI technology will allow them to basically become interoperable on their own. That is a theory that's out there, and it would undercut a lot of the people like me that go around saying, "Hey, we have to make sure that these softwares, just like in the past, can speak to one another." But there are others saying that don't worry, by the time we get these together, you'll basically tell the AI to make the data encrypted or double encrypted and triple encrypted and make sure it speaks to these other systems, and they'll just be able to do it. So the jury's out on that one.
Thank you, Jason. We have two questions in the chat, and I think we have about 10 minutes. So let me turn to the two questions for our experts. So this question is from Nokai. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, from Voice of Nigeria. Thank you so much for joining us. Her first question is there a conflict in capability and precision between unmanned and manned systems in today's battlefield domain, in terms of accuracy of force application and targets? Federico, maybe I'll turn to you on this one if you have any insights. Her second question relates to, do unmanned systems have these abilities of quick damage assessment as we're looking to explore, how do we do this with human in the loop or not in the loop? So Federico, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, we could stay here for hours to discuss this. I think definitely, I mean, at the moment, there's if you compare, crewed and uncrewed systems, I mean, you can have very, very different, performances in terms of accuracy, in terms of ability to stay on the target area, to ensure persistence, to provide endurance, and at the same time also be able to have a significant payload. So it really depends on the mission. It really depends on the type of the target that you are seeking to to acquire and to hit, or also for a different type of task. It's not necessarily for combat tasks. It can also be for other things. So I don't really see a huge difference in terms of accuracy, for instance, regarding the question between crewed and uncrewed systems. And it also goes down to the type of weapon that you are using if it comes to accuracy, and the type of sensors that you have. There are uncrewed systems that are really capable of providing absolutely astonishing quality in terms of accuracy and in terms of fidelity of the target, feed and everything. So I really don't see the need for this comparison. And when it comes to the persistence part, I think it's critical. Really, where they excel on crude system, and speaking of uncrewed systems, is really the persistent part. Persistence is really what they offer compared to most of the crude assets that we have, with few exceptions. But then you have the pilot in the cockpit, and so it really also increased the risk for human losses. So the persistence part is really what differentiates uncrewed from crewed systems at the moment.
Thank you so much, Federico. Great way to look at it as we debate how does this look over the future. We do have a question from Mohammed from the Business Standard newspaper in India. And Skip, maybe I'll turn to you for this question. How should NATO think about the vulnerability of its own rear area infrastructure and civilian data ecosystems in such a model? And does this require rethinking what constitutes a quote military target in a high intensity conflict?
Well, Mohammed, that's a great question, and let me say a number of things. First off, that I think we can see from both the Ukraine war, the Iran war, that the adversaries, Russia and Iran in this case, are not constrained by the types of military targets, law of armed conflict, et cetera, that we're used to, and that we consider as prohibitive or prohibited targets. They will strike those. And so that means we need to be prepared to defend them, protect that infrastructure. Well, what NATO has done is they've come up with a very clear, categorized set of what constitutes critical infrastructure for resilience in time of a conflict. And so they understand and they track that at the national level and aggregately at the NATO level, these various types of critical systems, be they transport systems, be they transport nodes, be they communications, be they C2 nodes, government C2, not military, there's obviously a military target, but also energy infrastructure, et cetera. And so at least NATO knows what to protect. It doesn't have the integrated, distributed system to protect that. So what we would expect them to do is they've got to prioritize protection. And they've got limited air missile defense assets now. Goes back to some of my open remarks about the need to scale the low-cost tiered systems in a distributed manner across nations, across allies, so that they can protect at least their priority targets. But they've got to come up with a prioritization first and think through what will the adversaries be targeting to undermine both the nation's ability to support the military defense, as well as what they may view as a vulnerable way to attack the will of the people to sustain the defense against aggression. So huge amount of work to be done there. But some of the initial, foundational analysis has been done.
Thank you so much, Skip. There has been so much conversation, as everyone on the line knows, about resilience and what does that actually look like and how do we execute. So thank you so much for that. Jason, thank you for your patience with your hand up. Please, over to you.
Thank you. Jason Bellini from Scripps News, our senior international correspondent, just returned from Ukraine and the Middle East. I followed the drone and counter-drone technologies very closely. And one thing I'm not up on, and maybe you could enlighten me, is naval drones. What's the state of play now for intercepting naval drones? And what would it take to secure an area as vast as, and also as confined as, the Port of Hormuz from threats that are in the water? We know those aren't the only threats that shipping would face and that military naval assets would face, but if for that alone, what would it take right now? And is that technology available?
Thank you so much, Jason. Skip, I see your finger up, but I think everybody would probably want to chime in on this. But Skip, please go ahead, start us off.
Okay, so Jason, I'd say yes, there's quite a bit of technology out there. In fact, I only know a little bit about the U.S. Programs of record. There's a number of them. They have the equivalent of the Marine autonomous defense system, the LMATIS, which is a mix of EW and kinetic response, and can jam and then it can engage. They also have the Helios, the laser weapon system, which is aboard many of the ships, and that's a laser hard kill. And then, of course, they've got the what's called a CRAM, which is used against drones specifically. You're talking about the surface drones that you see. Underwater drones are much more difficult to counter, and I don't know of systems currently available to counter those. So that's a gap that must be worked on. Even the U.S. Navy is looking at a whole series of small to large uncrewed ships, and from surface to underwater. And so they realize the importance of that capability, but there's a lot more work to be done on defense.
Thank you, Skip. Jason, perhaps I'll turn to you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Skip. Thank you, Jason. Um, I guess best maybe like some similarities and differences. In general, just the speed at which you scale a surface vessel and even an unmanned system is just it's not as fast in scaling the hardware, and then it's more difficult in scaling a lot of the software and C2 issues we have. As a submarine officer, formerly active duty, currently reserve, and of course, all these opinions are my own. I'm not on duty, but it just you end up with more communications challenges to subsurface. Um, and then back to my point about Anduril, I think it's very interesting to watch companies like Saronic that are building larger. I mean, 150 foot. I think the Marauder is uh, surface unmanned systems because it really does go back to my point about redefining what is the mission, potential mission of an unmanned system to be able to escort or to be able to provide a sort of a defense of a strategic line of communication. As a strategist, I see lots and lots of opportunities there. I mean, you could basically, you know, print them in an unlimited fashion and have a use for them. But whether or not you're actually able to get the communications to and the scale yet, it's just they're slower and they're behind in that regard. But obviously, everybody brings up the U-Force technology in the Black Sea for a country that has for Ukraine that had a very limited navy that was able to basically get a strategic checkmate on the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. So there's a lot of to be learned from that analogy.
Thank you, Jason. We have about 2 minutes left. Federico, I don't know if you want to weigh in on this for just a minute before we close out, please.
Yes, thanks, Katie. Thanks, Jason, for the question. I echo what Jason and Skip said. I mean, it's when it comes to surface vessels or underwater drones, it's a completely different picture. Defense against this type of assets is still more in an embryonic phase compared to counter US more generally. But I think there are some very elementary ways to counter them, especially when it comes to the subsurface threat. I mean, the Russians have been using nets to close, the access to ports and critical, docks in Crimea and elsewhere. So I don't see any reason why we shouldn't use the same technique. I mean, nets can be very, very helpful, and it's a kind of a passive tactic that can be really, really, really useful. And at the same time, you have to disperse assets. I mean, and that's the first thing, I think. So these passive countermeasures are critical. When it comes to surface vessels, Skip mentioned EW and other type of kinetic ways to defeat them. So yes, you can also use other surface vessels, other drones similar with the mission to destroy incoming drones. So that's my kind of very general take on that. And just very briefly on the questions from Damien on interest in Ukrainian technologies. I think I definitely agree with Skip. I think the real problem lies in the policy at the policy level, and especially from planners that do not see the priority to invest in these capabilities. After their many decades of peace dividends, we are not used to scale the investments to the point that is needed now. And so demand signal, I think, is the real problem. We don't have the sufficient demand signal for industry to scale production, because no company, with very few exceptions, will put resources invest resources to start a production line without the certainty that there is a contract coming. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Federico. We are at 10:30, as you all can tell. The four of us could talk about this for another hour, but we want to be cognizant of everyone's time. We want to thank you all so much for joining. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Michael, for some final notes.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining today's press briefing, and thanks to all of our experts and Katie for excellent moderation. We will be sending out a recording and an auto-generated transcript of this briefing to you all after this. If you have any questions that you'd like to follow up on, please reach out to press@cepa.org, and I'll put you in touch with our experts and all of our other fellows if you have questions on other topics. So thanks very much for joining, and thanks for everyone who spoke at today's event, and have a great day. Goodbye.